Hello and welcome to Fabula Celtica, a Celtic Studies podcast.
With Tyler Baxter
and Michael Frim.
Season 1, Ancient Ireland. Episode 6, Interview with a Deity. So, Con Ceirchach, is it? You may call me Con of the 100 Battles if it's easier. Well, Con, how did you hear about this position? I stepped on a stone and it, started shouting at me. Can you elaborate? My druid told me that he would tell me what the shouting meant in 53 days, and when I asked him again 53 days later, he said to come here. Ah, yes, one of our recruiters knew the position for an entire dynastic line of kings was about to turn up. So, tell me, how do you deal with pressure or stressful situations? All I need to keep me happy is a good drink or a good woman. Excellent. I was hoping you would say that. Come, let me introduce you to the many rulers your line will produce. My name is Lug, by the way. Welcome to Tara. So, Michael, it's been a while. How have you been?
Been pretty good, been very busy, but I'm very happy to be back here with the podcast.
I am as well. Yeah, it's kind of been very much crunch time and busy season in the academic world. I know that before our last podcast, we were just heading into exam season. So for you, that meant actually taking exams, and for me, that meant grading them.
Right. I don't know which one's worse.
I'm not sure either. I do have to admit that the grading went better for me than I expected. It was less painful than I anticipated. So that was good. But then immediately for me, it was into PhD applications, back into PhD applications. And also, we both had a conference to prepare for.
Yes, indeed. Very fun conference in Brest, Brittany, France, the Celtic Students Association conference. Tyler and I were traveling there from Cork, took a quick stop in first Dublin, then Paris, and then long train to Brest.
Yeah, not to mention the train we missed.
Right.
It was time and a half getting there, but we made it eventually. I don't know that it ended up being all that much faster than the 18-hour ferry that I took back to Cork. But I do have to say the ferry was less stressful for me.
Yeah, fair enough. The bus to plane to missed train to sprinting across Paris to make the next train. Not the most fun experiences, but we made it eventually.
And we got all the disasters out of the way on day one. And it was a 3-day conference. So the conference itself, I thought, went really well.
It was really, really fun. So many fascinating presentations, including yours, Tyler.
And including your own. Though I do have to say I was jealous how you had basically not practiced at all until the day before you were presenting, as far as you implied. And then when you presented the day of, it felt like super polished.
Thank you so much. To be perfectly honest, it was my undergrad dissertation research, and the presentation was essentially a presentation I had given a few months before, so all the practice had been done in the past.
Right.
And your presentation was, of course, very polished.
Well, that's because I was practicing it every day for about a month in advance. And I timed it perfectly. I don't know if I told you this, but we had roughly 20 minutes for each of our presentations, and you could be under time, but if you were over time, the chairperson who was overseeing that part of the conference would get you to hurry up and finish. And after I finished mine and had taken questions and things, the chair leaned over and whispered, "Good job. You had 10 seconds left before I was going to cut you off." So apparently 19 minutes and 50 seconds, beautifully timed.
Practice pays off.
It really does. But I think both of our presentation materials will eventually come up in this podcast. Yours dealing with Ogham or Ogham coming up in just a few episodes. Mine probably not until a future season when we look at Celtic revivalism. But sooner or later we'll get there.
Very excited for Ogham in a couple episodes.
Yes. So today's episode is also pretty exciting. I think we're really getting to that point where we are just at the end of the prehistoric material we've been looking at, and we're just about to step into the very early medieval period, the point at which we get our first native writing to Ireland, and this comes in conjunction with Christianity. Today's episode is just before we get to that point, and we're going to look at one of the most important Iron Age sites in all of Ireland in terms of the legendary material, and that is the Hill of Tara, or Tever, as it was called in Old Irish. Tara is one of these Iron Age complexes, much like we looked at Evanvacha or Navan Fort in a recent episode. We have mentioned Rath Grogan or Cruachan, also more briefly, along with some other sites, and this is one of those. This is sort of considered the central royal site in the legendary sources. It was the site of this legendary conception of a high kingship, which never really manifested in reality in terms of political power. The King of Tara, in terms of historical reality, never had control over a united Ireland, but it was still a very symbolic position to hold. And in many of the legendary sources, it seems to imply that this High King of Tara did have some sway over all of Ireland. And this site is made up of a number of smaller monuments. So I'm going to kind of work my way from north to south, naming some of these monuments, but they're all in fairly close proximity to each other. In kind of the most northern part of the main complex, we have the Clownerta, or the sloping ditches, which consist of a few smaller mounds or ring ditches. And one of these, for instance, is called Rath Grania. And many of you who are listening to this, who have previous familiarity with Irish mythology, will recognize the name Grania from the famous Finian tale of Diarmid and Grania. As we progress kind of from west towards east along that kind of most northern point of the complex, we get this long north-south oriented rectangle that has been dubbed the Chach Midcurtha, or the House of the Mead Circuit. But in reality, this doesn't seem to have been so much a building as more of a ceremonial avenue, and it seems to be one of the latest monuments, perhaps the latest prehistoric monument on the site. Continuing southward, we come to the Rath Nashanid, or the Rath of the Synods. A Rath meaning kind of a hill fort is sort of the general meaning there. And this is a structure dated to the 1st century of the Common Era that was used or occupied between the 1st and 4th centuries. There have been some Roman artifacts found there. It once contained a timber structure similar to the one that was burned seemingly ritualistically at Navan Fort. And the whole earthen mound was badly damaged in the 20th century when British Israelites decided to play Indiana Jones and come look for the Ark of the Covenant there. So that was an interesting little tidbit that I only learned very recently. Finally, we come down to the main sort of central part of the site, going a little bit more south, where we get the largest structure, the Bhreathnach, or the Wrath of the Kings, which is dated to the 1st century BCE. And this contains a few smaller monuments within its circumference. So if you will, imagine this ditch in roughly a circle with an outer bank, and then it's this mound in the interior. And the circumference of this rath, this mound, is about 1 kilometer. And originally this would have been marked by a stake wall. And inside it, there is the oldest structure on the site, which is known as the Mound of the Hostages, which is dated back to 3200 BCE. And that contains nearly 300 burials within this mound, most of them cremations, with about 30 more burials that seem to have happened during the Bronze Age, either in the passage into the mound or around the perimeter of it. That's kind of in the northern part of the Bhreathnach. And then in the center of it, there is this sort of figure 8 where we have two interconnected structures. One is the Chach Cormac, or the House of Cormac, and then we have the Onfora, the royal seat, on top of which is the famous Lia Fall, the Stone of Destiny, or allegedly this is the Lia Fall. And we will be talking about that Stone of Destiny and what it is as we proceed through this episode, but we have mentioned it briefly before as one of the 4 treasures that the Tuatha De Danann were said to bring to Ireland when they arrived in the Lever Gavala, or the Book of Invasions. Finally, we have the Rath Loigara to the south of the Bhreathnach, which is named after a character who is in the legendary sources, in the early Christian sources, is considered to be the last pagan king of Tara before Patrick shows up and starts converting the island. So we will be meeting him in the next episode. So I think that's enough archaeology for the moment, except to just say that the earliest structure here, the Mound of the Hostages, is much like some of our other Neolithic structures, such as when we talked about Newgrange. It does have a solar alignment. This one is aligned with the sunrise on Samhain, the beginning of winter, or modern-day Halloween, as well as with Imbolg, or the beginning of spring. The earliest written sources dealing with Tara are dated to the 7th century. We get references to this location in poems, in the hagiography or saints' lives of Patrick, in the annals, which we've mentioned before, these sort of very short descriptions of what happens in any given year that's recorded in monasteries. And we also get Tara mentioned in kings' lists. So, of course, we get kings of Tara mentioned in these kings' lists and royal genealogies. These sources often mix together myth, legend, and facts, and it's oftentimes hard to identify which is which. One example of this is that there were supposedly 5 great roads that radiated from Tara, which were supposed to have magically appeared to mark the birth of Conn Céadchathach, or Conn of the 100 Battles, who is someone we will be discussing today when we look at some of these legends around this site. And these 5 roads basically extended and connected Tara to all parts of Ireland, kind of radiating out in all directions from it. In the written sources, Tara is not so much a sanctuary of the old gods, like many people might associate it with it today. It's more of a bastion of kingship, where that kingship derives its legitimacy from supernatural associations. The last thing that I want to look at before we look at some of the stories surrounding this site is what the original Irish name Tever actually even means. We'll start with a medieval take on what Tever, this word for Tara, means by looking at Cormac's glossary, which is a text that was composed in the late 9th century, so a very early text, by a former king of Cashel, or the Rock of Cashel, so the royal site of Munster. And this king later became a bishop, and he lived until about 908 is when he was supposed to have died. So Cormac in his glossary gives 2 explanations for where the name Tever might come from. One uses the word for wall, which is mur, and I should explain for people listening that Tever in Old Irish is spelled Temair, M being a lenited M. In modern Irish, you would write MH to represent that V sound that I'm making. So this takes that second part, mur, as meaning wall, and the te at the beginning as a personal name. So this is the Wall of Tay. And in Irish mythology, one of the sons of Meath, Ériu, is one of the mythological kings of Tara, and he has a wife who is Tay of Thebes. So somehow he gets a Greek wife. But he brings her over from Greece, and while she's living with him at Tara, she dies of homesickness. So apparently he should have gone to live with her. This gives Tever its name from Tay plus mur, named in her honor. The other explanation given by Cormac is that Tever means a height from which there is a fine view, which is very much a stretch from a Greek word meaning something like icy that has to be manipulated quite a bit to get to the point where it becomes Tever. These are great examples of what we call synthetic or pseudo-etymology, which medieval people love to do all the time. And we've mentioned, for instance, the idea of Dinhenicus before, of the lore of place names. And many of these Dinhenicus tales are doing the same thing, where the medieval people are trying to come up with clever ways to give explanations for names of places or people that they don't actually know the true etymology of, and they try to come up with something that works and create a story for it or tie it into a pre-existing story. So the example that I'll try to remind people of is the etymology of Evenwache that we looked at before, being from the brooch at the neck of Macha, the Gwynn of Macha. The actual etymology of Tever seems much more likely to come from the same basis that the modern English word temple comes from. Temple in English comes from Latin templum, and we get a similar word with Greek temenos, which means sacred enclosure. This tem stem seems to come from a Indo-European root meaning to cut. And so Tever, perhaps, like these Greek and Latin words for a sacred space, may signify something more like a space that is cut off from the secular world. So it is a sacred enclosure, a place that is cut off, a place that is apart. This brings us to one of the first absolutely wild tales of how to become king of Tara. And that little skit that you heard me voice acting so professionally at the beginning is a play on this tale, which we'll now go ahead and elaborate on. Bailín Scal, or the Ecstasy of the Phantom, is a 9th century legend about the great King Con Chéadcatach, Khan of the 100 Battles, who is a semi-legendary figure that's usually assigned to have been ruling around 150 of the Common Era. He is really important in the legendary sources as the progenitor, one of the most important early descendants, or ancestors, I should say, of the Ineal clan, as well as the Connacht dynasty, two very powerful groups in medieval Ireland. So something that's important to remember as we look at different myths and legends is that there are oftentimes political messages or propaganda embedded within them, or there might be similar religious spins on some of these, as we will see as we proceed forward. In this particular story, Con is said to arise every morning with his 3 druids and his 3 fillith, or poets, at Tara to watch lest the men of the Sheath invade. So he is living in or near Tara, and he is getting up every morning to look out around the countryside. And I don't know, Michael, have you ever had a chance to visit Tara?
I have, actually. I had a chance a couple summers ago. It's a magnificent place. It's in County Meath, which is, if I'm not mistaken, just means middle.
Yes.
Meath. And it really is the middle of Ireland. It's really the heart of a lot of early Irish, prehistoric Irish activity. Yeah. So there's the Hill of Tara. There's also Newgrange just a little ways away, which you can see from the Hill of Tara. It's really an incredible landscape and really emphasizes the variety of activities that were happening in prehistoric Iron Age, early medieval Ireland. All of these things happening, really right here in very close proximity. So it's a really interesting place.
Yeah, and one of the things that was most striking to me when I had the chance to visit was what a great view there is from the top of Tara. Kidding. So this idea that you can stand within that Rathnari, that large enclosure, and you can look all around you in every direction, and you can see for miles. So this is indeed a fantastic vantage point to go look out for invaders from the other world, as Con seems to be doing in this story.
Absolutely it is. And sorry to interrupt the story, but just while we've brought up kind of the landscape of Tara and around Tara, just to go back a little bit to archaeology, and thank you for that wonderful introduction to Tara. I didn't want to interrupt while you were giving all of this really excellent background information. But most of what I'm about to say draws a lot from this one paper by Aidan O'Sullivan and Jonathan Kinsella. They wrote this article, Living by a Sacred Landscape, interpreting the early medieval archaeology of the Hill of Tara. And it kind of asks the question, what did the medieval people who were living in this area, in this landscape, what did they think of the Hill of Tara? Which is so important when we're considering these written sources. Whoever the authors were, or wherever the stories came from, they were being written down in the medieval period. So it's being informed by and informing this medieval image and understanding of the Hill of Tara and what it means. And as we'll see, it has a lot to do with kingship and sovereignty and really interesting stuff. But just from an archaeological perspective, which isn't really able to get at those kinds of, second degree thought processes, but is able to get at stronger, more foundational evidence of what's going on. The Hill of Tara wasn't inhabited in the medieval period. However, its environs were really heavily used, both as economic and religious and social centers. Clearly, the environs of the Hill of Tara were being used, were being lived in a lot in the medieval period, but the hill itself wasn't. There's scant evidence of medieval activity there, except for a few potential very early medieval burials. And perhaps, I haven't read this article in a while, so, please, dear listener, fact check me. But even some later medieval burials as well. All of this is pointing that people were aware that this hill was here. Obviously, it's right there. It's in the sources. They weren't living there. They were living right next to it. And there were a few burials there too. Perhaps even secular burials, not associated with any ecclesiastical centers, even though right around the hill there were a bunch of ecclesiastical centers. All of this really is to say the medieval people were very aware of this hill being there. Clearly it was important in their mind because it was right there and there were only a few activities going on there, which emphasizes its importance. It's all over the sources, which again emphasizes its importance. So the fact that no one was living there, that it was just this place of burial and, as we'll see, association with kingship and sovereignty, clearly it was important in a special and unique way in the minds of the medieval peoples living around it, in the minds of the medieval authors writing about it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, but it also makes me reflect on a couple other royal sites. So Navan Fort or Evenwache and Cruchen, I believe, were both very similar in terms of, as far as I can recall, they don't seem to have been occupied during the medieval period, but there's still these sites that are regularly referred to, still seem to be sites where certain events take place. And with the idea of sort of ecclesiastical proximity, we have, with Navan Fort at least, we have the very, very famous site of Armagh, very, very close by, I think something like 3 miles away. So there's definitely some parallels with other royal sites from these sources. I'm not sure about Dunallin in Leinster, or Knockallin in English, but Cashel in Munster was built on during the medieval period. There was a castle there, and followed by a church or cathedral, which the ruins are still there to this day.
One short bus ride away from Cork.
Yes, indeed. It's a lovely site to visit for 30 minutes or so.
All this is to say that these places were very much living landscapes, and people were aware of these sites. And now, thanks to the literary sources that we're going to get into, we can ask questions about what were they thinking about these sites.
And at least as far as this story about Conn is concerned, dating him to 150 CE does put him in that pre-medieval period when the site could theoretically have had some people knocking around. In fact, we know there were people still occupying the site until about the 4th century. So this actually fits. Conn, as we were saying, has this lovely view from Tara to look for any incoming otherworld invaders from the Shiva with his 3 poets and his 3 druids, and he does this every morning. But one morning, he chances upon a stone and trods upon this stone, and when he does, it cries out, it shouts multiple times, and he is very disconcerted by this, as I think most of us would be. I know if I stepped on something and it started shouting at me, I would probably assume I'd stepped on a poor animal or something, but I would be relieved to see it's a rock, and then I would be less relieved and probably have to go see a doctor. But his druid says, "Oh, I can't tell you what this means for 53 days. So Khan's like, "Okay, I guess I have to wait for 53 days. And he waits for this strange, very specific period of time. And the druid tells him that the number of cries that the stone shouted when he trod upon it is the number of kings that Khan's line will produce. The specific number is not given here, but I do have to wonder if the 53 days is perhaps related to that number in some way. And then the druid says, "I can tell you this much, but I can't tell you specifically any more about who your descendants will be. That's not my place." But seeming to imply that he might know more than he can say. So Khan's like, "Okay, this sounds great, I suppose. Got a good dynasty ahead of me." And after this conversation, a cover of fog comes over Khan and his cohort. And an unknown rider comes through this fog and starts harrying them. It starts poking at them with a spear. And they're all not too happy about this until the druid says something about, "Don't you know who you're messing with? This is Khan of the 100 Battles." And at that point, the rider stops messing with them and says, "Oh, you're Khan, are you? Well, why don't you come along with me then? I've got something to show you." And he introduces himself as Lug, one of the great members of the Tuatha De Danann, who we will look at much more closely when we look at the second battle of Magturith, one of the great and very wild, confusing, legendary texts of the period, and closely related to the Book of Invasions, the Liber Gabala, that we have already gone through. So Lug escorts Khan into the other world, into the Sheath, and he acts as a sort of prophet who foretells the names of all these kings of Tara who are going to belong to the Enail dynasty that Khan is sort of the beginning figure of. So the druid couldn't say this because I guess it was a god's place to. It was Lug's place to go and tell him who all these people are. He actually physically is able to kind of take Khan into this palace, this feasting hall, and say, "This is so-and-so, and this is so-and-so, and this is so-and-so. These are your descendants." So it's sort of like this place out of time. He's able to interact with all these characters from a great span of the future. And Lug also tells a young woman who is present here, who is identified very explicitly as Sovereignty with a capital S. She is asked to dispense drink to Khan. And this is a very important motif that we're going to see again and again, where this goddess figure, this female otherworld supernatural figure, is a representative of sovereignty, and she interacts with the king in one of a couple of ways to really bestow the right to rule upon him. With this first story, what we see are a couple of different means by which one can take the kingship of Tara. One involves the Liafal, this stone of destiny that cries out when a proper king steps upon it. Another is that the king is chosen by an important otherworld entity such as Lug, or this sovereignty goddess. First of all, thank you for coming on such short notice. We had to let our previous king of Tara go after the old debacle with the wife-daughter mix-up. Terrible, really. So, Brion, how do you feel about a practical interview? Sure. What would you like me to do? Try to sell you this quill? Guess how many human heads will fit in a chariot? Kiss me. Excuse me, miss, that is highly inappropriate. A shame. It seems that this position isn't for you. Next! You are out of your mind. No way is this job worth... Ugh. Allo, Fiacra, Fergus, you do not want to go in there. The interviewer is this nasty old crone who asked me to kiss her. But Niall have her if he's desperate enough. What? Gross! Fuck her up, Niall. Give those crusty lips some love, little brother. Hello, miss. How about a hello kiss and you're hired? Okay, but to a modern audience, this is going to seem highly inappropriate. It's myth times, babe. Well, I suppose it's not like this is being broadcasted to the world or anything. So, there is a wonderful story that is just as wild in different ways as many of the stories we've encountered, and just as long, perhaps even a little longer than the Second Battle of Mag Tuireadh that we mentioned a moment ago. And it's a story that I believe we mentioned before when we were looking at Newgrange, called Tochmarc Edina, or the Wooing of Aideen. In this story, a whole lot of different things happen. The part of this story that we mentioned before is when the goddess of the Boyne gets together with the Dagda, and the Dagda stops the sun in the sky so that her husband doesn't notice that anything is going on, if you'll recall that story. Well, in a completely different part of the story, a good ways in, we have a king of Tara whose name is Accath Erev, and he takes the kingship of Ireland, or the kingship of Tara, and then he summons the men of Ireland to hold the Feis Tevra, or the Feast of Tara, the Festival of Tara, the year after he takes his kingship. That was an assembly wherein people from sort of all the areas under a particular king were brought together to have festivities, do sporting events, but also do important things like declare their taxes. So it's to judge rents and taxes of Eccath's subjects for the next 5 years. But it's also a word that's etymology refers just as much to a feast, an assembly, as it does to the idea of marriage. It's closely related to a word for lying together with. So all the men of Ireland who are supposed to respond to a call to such an assembly give the same answer to the king when he attempts to call this feis. And they all say, nope, we're not going to come because you're not married. You don't have a queen, and therefore we don't recognize you. And so Accath has to try to deal with this situation pretty quickly. See, the thing is that he did have a queen previously, but she kind of got kidnapped by this otherworld guy named Mither, who had been her husband in one of her past lives. It's a long story. We'll go through the whole thing properly at a later point. Accath petitions Mither. He gets the opportunity to have one chance at getting his wife back. Mither brings Aideen, the woman who he was formerly married to, that was his queen, and now is back with Mither in her new incarnation after this past life that again, we don't have time to go through right now, but it's this whole mess. And Mither has this test that he has to pass, and that is that he sets out 50 look-alike women who all look like Aideen in front of Accath and says, pick which one's your wife. In order to do this, Accath knows that his wife Aideen has a very specific skill, and that's pouring drink. And this should sound very similar to that story of Con that we just looked at. So he asks all 50 women to pour drink for him one at a time so that he can watch their technique. And by doing so, he hopes to identify his wife. Well, he goes down the line. He's like, nope, not her, not her, not her, all the way down to number 49. And when number 49 pours a drink, he's like, oh, that's super close. It's just a touch off, but maybe she's nervous. Yeah, I think this is my wife. This one. I'll take her. And so Mither accedes. Yaakov takes this woman, who we will also call Aideen, whether it's the same one or not. We'll see in a minute. But he takes this woman and off he goes. Some time passes. He's with this woman who he believes to be Aideen, his wife. He conceives a child with her, and soon after that he learns, oh no, he actually picked up his daughter by his original wife. So we get another lovely case of incest in a good Irish legend. So I don't know why this keeps happening, but there it is. And again, there's this sort of messing with time element, because not enough time has passed for a child that the original Aideen was pregnant with to have grown up all the way to be the age that she's at when Eckith selects her from this test. So something timey-wimey is going on there. I want to compare this to another story called the Actra Macnechach, or the Adventures of the Sons of Eckith Mugmadon, who is a different Eckith. And this is a story of a character named Niall of the Nine Hostages, who is a legendary descendant of Con Céadchach, Con of the 100 Battles, and is said to have lived in the 5th century. So he's several generations later. And in this story, we have, again, a sovereignty figure, a woman who is, in this case, disguised as a hideous hag guarding a well. And Niall and his brothers are out and about in the country, and they really need some water. So they come across this well where this hag is guarding, and they ask if they can have some of the water from the well. And she says, sure, no problem, if they're willing to give her a kiss. If they give her a kiss, she will give them the water they want. So all of them are like, I don't know, you look kind of diseased, you're pretty darn ugly, I don't think I can do it. And so all his brothers refuse. One of his brothers, Fiachra, does manage to give her a kiss on the cheek, but it's not really enough for her. She wants a real kiss. So finally Niall, who's actually only a half-brother to the other 4 brothers with him, he's willing to take one for the team. And so he gives her a real kiss. And also seems to do more than just that. What one of my favorite podcasts, Michael, it's not an academic podcast by any means, but it's called What the Folklore. And so they're more folk tales than legends, but they refer to a downstairs kiss as their euphemism for sleeping with someone. So a kiss and a downstairs kiss seems to be involved here. When he kisses her, she turns into a beautiful woman and reveals that she is sovereignty, and she gives him the kingship of Tara. This should sound familiar to people because we had a story featuring a hag where we had a bunch of brothers, but it was very much kind of an inversion of what we're seeing here. It was the story of Macha among Ruith, or Macha of the Red Tresses, in our episode where we looked at Evan Vacha. And in that story, it was Macha, this woman who had gained the kingship of Ulster, Navan Fort, and these rivals for her throne all came across her when she was disguised as a hag. But all of them were actually still willing to sleep with her, so kind of the opposite of what we're seeing here. But in that story, she ties them all up. She doesn't want to be with any of them because she wants to maintain her sovereignty, and she doesn't want to give sovereignty to these people. So it's sort of an inverse of the same story we're looking at here. Another legend, this one's less a narrative and more of kind of a general idea that comes up in a few places, is there's this character whose name is Medivh Lethderrig, and she is a different Medivh from this famous Queen Medivh or Queen Maeve of Connacht. This is a Medivh of Leinster. Medivh is a name that seems to frequently be associated with female characters who have royal status or some sort of connection to sovereignty. Her name also seems to indicate that she was once one of these sovereignty goddesses, because her name is cognate with the word for mead in English, the intoxicating beverage. So her name means something like the intoxicating one. By offering a man a drink and or to sleep with him, she symbolically seems to be offering him the kingship. this rite of fertility and union between the king and a representative of the land that he will rule over. So this character, Medb Lethderrig, was married to multiple kings of Tara, and she, quote, tolerated no king at Tara without his having her as a wife, end quote. She could rule Tara on her own until the rightful king could be found as well. So this is very much like that Macha character from that earlier episode, where if there's no one good enough around to be your husband, just take the rulership yourself. Again, we're seeing this sovereignty figure show up in many of these stories. So ways to take the kingship of Tara so far seem to be that we get the Stone of Destiny, the Lia Fall, shouting underfoot. We have a otherworld entity such as Lug showing up and saying, hey, here's your destiny. And then we have this sovereignty goddess figure who offers a drink and or sleeps with the person who she deems worthy of kingship. Another character that this does remind us of, though, I think from an earlier episode, is Ériu, the goddess who is the personification of Ireland in the Lever Gavala. In that story, Ériu does not sleep with anyone or offer anyone drink, but she does promise the sons of Meath her favor when they agree to give the name of Ireland her name. And she also, as I mentioned in that episode, when the Tuatha De Danann are using their druids to drive away the ship of the sons of Meath with magic, Avergan, the poet, is able to counteract that magic so that they can sail back to Ireland and claim sovereignty of Ireland when he sings this poem that's in praise of Ireland, and so by extension seems to be a praise poem to Ériu. So in that case, it's not quite the same dynamic of this sovereignty goddess figure directly having union with or pouring drink for the sons of Meath, but instead she is getting the payment of her name given to the land and also this praise poem that Avergan sings or chants. If the next candidate could come in, please. Sorry, one moment. So, Conora Móir, tell me about why are you naked? Well, my bird dad told me that if I came naked, I would become the king of Tara. Well, I do like what I see. Tell me, what are your greatest strengths aside from, the assets on clear display in front of me right now? Does navigating a magical obstacle course via a chariot drawn by uncontrollable horses count? When can you start? To continue our rundown of different ways to take the kingship of Tara, we're going to look at a story known as the Destruction of Dodurga's Hostel. This story features the king Conora Móir, who is attributed to the 1st century, and he is the son of Echith and Aideen, who may be the same Echith and Aideen of the Buin of Aideen, but may be a completely different pair of people depending on which source you go to and who you ask. So we're not going to even delve into that, and never mind the fact that there's a complication that the Echith in the story we looked at from the Buin of Aideen was with 2 Aideens, not one. his original wife and then his daughter by that wife. So all sorts of complication already shows up. It's unknown to him that his father, so that was the son of the daughter of Echith and Aideen, so the grandson, I suppose, of them. His father, on the other hand, is a guy named Nameglon or Nevglon. I'm not sure if that's a lenited M or not. Michael, as you know, it's a little bit of a hit and miss depending on whether that's going to happen in a consonant cluster. But Nameglon is the king of birds, and he has the ability to take a bird or human form. But Conora Móir is brought up without this knowledge, and there is this event at Tara known as a bull feast, which is a prophetic ceremony. It's this really interesting idea where I'm just going to read directly this description from the Celtic heroic age to describe exactly what this bull feast is. And we're told, quote, "That is, a bull used to be killed by them, and one man, a filla or a druid, would eat his fill of it and drink its broth, and a spell of truth was chanted over him in his bed. Whoever he would see in his sleep would be king, and the sleeper would perish if he uttered a falsehood. The bull feaster then in his sleep at the end of the night beheld a man stark naked passing along the road of Tara with a stone in his sling." End quote. So we have this particular ritual for being able to see a future event. And in this particular vision, at this particular bull feast, the one who is having the vision, this filla, this poet, or this druid, foresees this naked man coming towards Tara holding a sling with a stone in it. Okay, strange enough. Chonairi doesn't know anything about this particular vision. He is off going hunting, which is something he normally does. As he's off hunting, he sees these very interesting, very strange speckled birds on the Liffey plain. Now, whenever you get strange, unusual birds showing up in one of these tales, there's something supernatural going on with them. They're oftentimes otherworld people, or they're fallen angels, or all sorts of things like that. So this is an immediate red flag for anyone who wants to be wary of supernatural stuff, but the characters in these stories are never wary of it. They just want the interesting birds. So Chonairi goes after these otherworld birds, and he starts trying to attack them, shoot them down from the sky with his sling. And the birds are not too happy about this, so they all transform into people, and they start attacking him and completely outnumber him. It's looking very bad for Chonairi until one of them steps forward to protect him and announces that he is Newman, the king of the birds, and he is your father, Chonairi. Newman tells Chonairi, "Hey son, sorry I haven't been in your life, but I'm going to make it up to you. You need to strip naked and go walk back to Tara right now. Make sure you have your sling with you, and if you arrive at dawn, you're going to be king, and it's going to be great." Apparently, this is convincing, and Chonairi does exactly as his dad says. I would have had some questions myself, but, he's confident in his body. He strips down, and away he goes. And, of course, this exactly coincides with this prophecy at the bull feast, and so the people welcome him as their new king. And so that's another point on our list. We've got the Stone of Destiny, we've got Otherworld Entity Selection, we've got Sovereignty Goddess, and we've got Fulfilling of a Prophecy as different ways that one can take the kingship of Tara.
And I'll just add for that last one, Fulfilling a Prophecy, I think the destruction of Dodurga's hostel is really interesting in that the prophecy is kind of fulfilled on purpose, where the prophecy is known, and though I guess Chonairi isn't the one consciously doing so, but he's being told to, the prophecy is known, and so the circumstances to make Chonairi king, according to this prophecy, are brought about on purpose after the fact, if that makes sense, where it's not exactly that the prophecy is bringing anything about per se, but rather the prophecy is known, and so as to get sovereignty, it is satisfied. So I suppose just an interesting way of fulfilling a prophecy.
Yes, I think so. But I think it also is kind of a storytelling case in point of what actually happens with prophecies that are supposed to be about the real world in a lot of our medieval sources. When you have, for example, if we go over to the Welsh tales and you look at, say, the prophecies of Merlin or the prophetic poems of Taliesin, a lot of these things seem to have been composed after the thing that they're supposed to be prophesying about. So they have the benefit of hindsight in their very composition. Then they try to play them off of, oh yeah, this was written before though. Or they're just written in such a vague way that they could be construed a million different ways to make them true. So it's interesting that we get something of that sort actually explicit within this story. But I think prophecy in Irish tales is a really interesting idea in that pretty much anytime a character prophesies something, And usually it's a druid or a Phila, a poet, or a otherworld figure. But sometimes it's a hero, like Cuchulainn, for example, has this whole exchange with the Morrigan, this sort of battle goddess, and she's prophesying this future altercation they're going to have, where she's going to try to prevent him from winning a duel. And so she starts saying, well, I'm going to become an eel and entangle your legs while you're in this battle at this ford. And he says, well, you're in that eel form. I'm just going to crush you against a rock and break your ribs. And they kind of have this whole back and forth where she says, I'm going to do this. And he says, well, I'm going to do that. And rather than trying to counteract her prophecy, he accepts it is going to happen that way, but he adds to it and turns it to his advantage. And of course, the events happen just as they say they will when it comes to that point in time.
Kind of battle of prophecies.
Yes. A prophetic rap battle. Oftentimes these prophecies are couched in poetic terms. So it's really interesting how the prophecies pretty much always are going to work out, but exactly as stated. But there's oftentimes something of a twist like this that keeps the interest there, even though you know to expect that, yes, this prophecy will come true. I don't think I can think of any stories where there's a prophecy involved in the Irish context that doesn't come true.
Nor can I.
Well, very, very good. We may come across one someday. Oh, and I guess also in regards to this idea of a bull feast, there are a number of Irish texts and indeed Celtic stories more widely, Welsh in particular, where we have rituals sort of this nature involving using sort of a ritualistic sleep where you will either foresee future events or learn otherwise unlearnable information through having this sleep after consuming a certain broth or following a certain process or being in a certain location. And this idea of a bowl being involved specifically reminds me of a story from the Welsh Mabinogion, the Dream of Hronawi, which only appears in the Red Book of Hergest. Most of the Mabinogion stories are contained in both the White Book of Bhreathnach and the Red Book of Hergest, and we'll talk about those at some point in the future when we get to Welsh material. But in this particular story, there's a framing narrative that sets up this group of characters, one of whom is this soldier named Hronawi, the titular character, and they need a place to stay for the night, so they end up going and staying in this hovel. And there's this dirty skin on the floor of the hovel where Hronawi sleeps. And I think it is explicitly a bull skin. I might be misremembering that. It's some sort of animal skin. So it reminds me of this bull feast idea, because the bulk of the story is not this framing narrative, but is this dream that he has while sleeping on this skin. And so there seems like there's this theme of prophetic sleep that involves some sort of ritual, involves the consumption of or the sleeping upon the remains of an animal of some kind that pops up more than once and pops up across a fairly wide geographic range. To return to the Tara stories, another tale, Deisill Conor Amor, or the Seed of Conor Amor, is yet another story of this king Conora, the same one we were just looking at, but gives a completely different explanation for how he becomes the king of Tara. In this story, there is said to be a king's chariot at Tara, and the chariot is yoked to two horses that have never been harnessed before, so they've never been broken in, they've never been trained, and any man who tries to approach and go into the chariot who's not destined for kingship, the chariot will tilt under him, and he won't be able to control the chariot or the horses that are supposed to pull it, and he'll be thrown from the chariot. There's also inside the chariot a king's mantle, so this sort of cape-like garment that he's supposed to wear, and it will fit him perfectly if he is destined for kingship, but it will be too big if he's undeserving of the kingship. So we've got magical mantle, we've got this chariot with these uncontrollable horses, and then to top this off, once you're in the chariot and you've put on the mantle and everything's so far so good, you've harnessed the horses and you still haven't been thrown, well, now you actually have to go somewhere. You specifically have to drive the chariot between these flagstones. And the description of this is that there are these two flagstones named Block and Blugna. Strange enough that these stones have their own names, but the story says that, quote, "And there were two flagstones in Tara, Block and Blugna. When they accepted a man, they would open before him until the chariot went through. And Fall was there, the stone penis at the head of the chariot course. When a man should have the kingship of Tara, it screeched against his chariot axle, so that all might hear. But the two stones, Block and Blugna, would not open before one who should not hold the sovereignty of Tara, and their usual position was such that one's hand could only pass sideways between them. Also, he was not to hold Tara's kingship. The fall would not screech against his axle." End quote. So that is translated by Gwynn in Ériu Volume 6. I imagine this like the automatic doors to, a grocery store or whatever that should open up as you approach, but these automatic doors formed by these two flagstones will only separate from each other if you are the rightful king of Tara. And not only that, you have to have your chariot wheel screech against the Leah Fall, this same stone that Con, in our first story, trod upon and it shouted at him. So there's still this element of the Leah Fall screaming out, but in this case, it's rationalized almost. Not that any of this setup is rational, but the idea is not that the stone has the power to shout itself, but you do have to get your chariot wheel to screech just so against it and make this awful racket.
I'd also add, interesting that, its name, Stone Penis, gives it this kind of phallic nature. And we've already seen associations between sexuality and sovereignty, probably because of, associations between human sexuality and fertility of the land, human fertility and agricultural fertility. So I guess these connections are being made very explicit here, with the fall not only being a stone that may look phallic, but actually, having a phallic name.
Yes. And Michael, since you have visited Tara, you've seen the stone that is supposed to be the Leah Fall, and it's definitely a phallic shape.
I have seen the stone, and the associations are not lost on modern graffiti artists, so I'll leave it at that.
Yes, so I think this idea that there could be a phallic reading into pillar stones in general is one that should be kept in mind. There are certain stories where I think that reading actually enhances the experience of the narrative. Chonairi, in any case, he has to do all these ridiculous things, has to make it all work. So he enters the chariot, and Gwynn continues to say, quote, "And the chariot received him. 'Gird the cloak about thee,' said his mother. He dons it, standing in the presence of the hosts. The cloak fitted him. He stands in the chariot, and it moves under him. He goes towards the two stones, and they open before him. He goes to the fall, with all the hosts around him, and his mother before him. The fall cries out. 'Fall has accepted him,' cried the hosts." End quote. So he seems to have no problem accomplishing all these things exactly as prescribed. And what is an interesting connection here is that in that first story we looked at, Bala and Skull, I didn't say it at that point, but recall that Con Cegthach goes out every day with his 3 Philith and his 3 druids. And the names of his 3 druids in that story are Mile, Block, and Blugna. So aside from Mile, we have the exact same names for 2 of these druids that are the names of these 2 stones in the story of Chonairi. The story known as Dignai Tevrach, the remarkable places of Tara, further says, quote, "Beside the fort of the Synods to the north stand 3 small stones, to wit, the stones that were set over the wizards. These are their names, Moil and Block and Blugna. Moil to the east, Block to the south, and Blugna to the north." End quote. And that's translated by Whitley Stokes in the Rend and Hennicus, section 21. We have 3 stories naming these 3 characters, or in the Conor Moore story, 2 characters who have these same names, Moil, Block, Blugna. And in our first story, they are druids or wizards, as Stokes translates druids. In the Conor Moore story, they are magical stones. And in the Rend and Hennicus, they are burial markers of 3 druids. So we've got this confusion that seems to be running through the tradition, which is quite interesting. And it reminds me of a lot of folk tales that tend to associate pillar stones or standing stones with the transfigured or petrified forms of witches or other usually supernatural people, or sometimes victims of supernatural punishments.
And you can imagine why when you have a massive standing stone on the landscape where you want to set a story, how can you explain that stone being there? This massive object, you can't imagine lifting it. It has to be supernatural.
Yes, I think that's a fair assumption. Going back to our list of ways to get the kingship, we have, again, the Stone of Destiny cries out. We have Otherworld Entity says, hey, you got destiny with you. We've got Sovereignty Goddess pouring drink or doing a downstairs kiss with you. We have fulfilling a prophecy. And we have this most recent example, which is succeeding in ordeal or a series of ordeals, usually of a somewhat magical nature and somewhat skilled-based nature. Finally, we're going to turn to a small portion of the story known as the birth of Cormac. And Cormac, I think, is probably one of the more famous legendary kings of Ireland. He's oftentimes seen as sort of the Irish Solomon. He's supposed to be a very wise, very just king. And in section 10 of the story about him, it's called The Birth of Cormac. This is well past his birth. He's already grown up at this point, at least to being a functional adult. In the other stories we've looked at, I've kind of played off of the idea of them being job interviews. Here, this is really more of a, if we compared it to a modern world situation, would be more like Cormac gets a promotion for great job performance, and the person who was in the position that he ascends to gets a demotion or gets fired. In this story, we have Cormac MacArt, who's also of the line of Con Cegcathach and Niall of the Nine Hostages, and he is earlier on in the descendancy than Niall. He's a couple of generations. He's the grandson, I believe, of Con. He was just going into Tara one day. He's not a king or anything yet, but he meets this female hospitaller, Ban Brugha, named Benith. And a Brugha is the most wealthy, highest class of farmer. They've got tons of land, tons of cattle. We'll talk about them in more detail later. It's interesting that this is a woman who is being described as a Brugha here. It's usually translated as hospitaller because one of the expectations that this particular class of farmer had was they had to have their house placed at a crossroads, and they had to freely give hospitality to all sorts who would be passing by. Well, it so happens that Benith's sheep have gotten a little carried away, and they've eaten all of the queen's woad plants. So the current king of Tara, whose name is Lugath, judges that Benith's sheep should be given to the queen in compensation for the damage to her plants. Well, Cormac enters the house in Tara, and he hears all this going on, and he says, oh, hold on a minute. Shouldn't it be that the queen is compensated with the wool of the sheep? Because the wool will regrow and the woad will regrow, so that's sufficient compensation. And everyone's like, oh yeah, that sounds way better. That's a true judgment right there. And as this is going on, apparently this is a house with two sides somehow. It's not clearly explained exactly what the architecture is. But the side of the house in which the false judgment made by Lugith was given collapses, and the side in which Cormac gave the true judgment stays standing. And this is sort of a Dinhenicus tale that gives a rationale for the name of the Clonarta Tevroch, the sloping ditches of Tara, one of those locations, monuments that we mentioned at the top of the episode. Cormac is then named king for having said this great judgment and for this providential moment of the house collapsing on the side where the false judgment was made. And from then on, he is this very wise and noble and just king. And so our final bullet point on this list of ways to take the kingship of Tara is the idea of making a true judgment. And as a way to gain the kingship, well, you can lose kingship for making a false judgment. This idea of rightness, of what's called core, or of fear, meaning truth, is really, really important in the legendary sources and comes up again and again, especially in the context of rulership. It reminds me as well of Avergan's judgment in the story of the taking of Ireland by the sons of Meath in the Lever Gavala, when Avergan is said to give the very first judgment in Ireland by saying, we'll go just past 9 waves, and if we're able to return, Ireland is ours. And that was a true judgment and allowed the sons of Meath to take sovereignty. So we actually have seen this theme once before. Well, Michael, I think that's about it from me. Do you have any last thoughts about Tara and this idea of the kingship there?
No, I feel like that was very comprehensive, really interesting stuff when it comes to Tara. Such a long-lasting archaeological site. I mean, from 3200 BCE through the medieval period, that's just massively long. So clearly an incredibly important site, a really interesting site from both an archaeological and a literary perspective, given how important it is in the sources, how much it's associated with sovereignty, with kingship. You know, this is the place you go when you want to be king of Ireland. And weird rituals happen for the rightful king, you know, stone crying out or sovereignty pouring you a drink. Clearly there's a lot going on in the minds of these medieval authors, in the minds of the medieval audiences listening to these stories when they look at Tara, which was very, very much within the medieval Irish landscape and in the minds of these people.
Yes, indeed. We will see everyone next time when we will come back to Tara briefly to talk about the arrival of Christianity and the arrival of St. Patrick.
Thank you for listening to Fabula Celtica
with Tyler Baxter
and Michael Frim. Follow us at Fabula Celtica on Twitter, Instagram, or Blue Sky, or email us at fabulaceltica@gmail.com. Which is so important when we're considering these written sources, because they were being written by...
That was Kevin! You were saying they were written by? Oh, we might just wait.
I'm Butterfingers.
See you later. That was very funny.
He did exactly what he said he won't do.
No, he did exactly what he said he would.
Well.
Anyways.
Well, I suppose it's not like this is being broadcasted to the world or anything. How was that, Michael?
Very impressive range.
Thank you. Top tier acting right there. I don't know why I haven't been hired for jobs like this before.
Well, with this kind of exposure.
Yeah, this is what we need. This is what will get my name out there.